Your attention to the field as we recognize the parents or guardians of the seniors of the class of 2017 who play a part in bringing you these Friday night football shows. Tonight is Parents' Night, and on the field you see parents and guardians of all senior varsity football players, athletic trainers, band members, Blue Blazers members, cheerleaders, and student council officers escorting their sons and daughters. Program sponsors are Wildcat Band Director Charlie McCauley, Blue Blaze Director Christy McCullough, Cheerleader sponsor Brianna Ritchie, Student Council sponsor Alyssa Butler, Athletic Training sponsor Tammy Carell, and Head Football Coach Greg Owens. Please hold your applause until I've introduced all of these parents, guardians, and students. Starting with football. Ms. LaTonya Hawkins escorting her son Jalen, who's a running back. Mr. and Mrs. Bruce Silman escorting their son, Easton, who's a linebacker. Ms. Dina Wright escorting her son, Tyrese Peters, a wide receiver. Mr. Dustin Hall, Ms. Patience Stark, and Chris Aguilar escorting their son, TJ Hall, wide receiver. Mr. and Mrs. Mike Cleveland escorting their son, Mason, who's a linebacker. Mr. and Mrs. David Reynolds escorting their son, Matt, a wide receiver. Mrs. Consuelo Neal and Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Lewis escorting their son and grandson, Isaiah Neal, a defensive lineman. Mr. and Mrs. Doremus Adams escorting their son Braylon, a running back. Mr. and Mrs. John Burnside escorting their son Brenton, a defensive lineman. Mr. Terry Green and Ms. Tammy Green escorting their son Richard, an offensive lineman. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Hall escorting their son Jalen, a linebacker. Mr. Brian Tennyson escorting his son Haven, who plays defensive lineman. Mr. Gerald Pierce escorting his son Logan, an offensive lineman. Mr. and Mrs. Thad Gregory escorting their son Gideon, offensive lineman. Mr. and Mrs. Heath Darrow escorting their son Jesse, an offensive lineman. Mr. Rodney Grant and Ms. Elvira Dial escorting their son Trey, a defensive back. Ms. Nicole Cooks Petty and Mr. Raymond Petty escorting their son and grandson Cameron Cooks, a defensive lineman. Mr. James Bales and Miss Shelley Bales escorting their daughter Brittany, an athletic trainer. Mr. Darrell Petty and Ms. Dimitri Petty escorting their daughter Danielle, an athletic trainer. Ms. Patricia Perez and Mr. Armando Perez escorting their son and brother, Rodolfo, athletic trainer. Mr. and Mrs. Heath and Karen Anderson escorting their daughter, Rachel, front ensemble in the band. Mr. and Mrs. Jerry and Lisa Bell escorting their son Benjamin, plays saxophone. Mr. and Mrs. Adam and Leslie Whitson escorting their daughter Molly Clegg, who plays the flute. Mr. and Mrs. Tony and Susan Cook escorting their son John, who plays the bass drum. Mr. and Mrs. Ramon and Marlon Corona escorting their son Christian, who plays the trumpet. Ms. Jane Crouch escorting her son Gabe, who plays the trombone. Mr. and Mrs. Jesus and Brandy Diaz de Leon escorting their son Christian, who plays the trombone. Mr. and Mrs. Brandon and Joanna Foster escorting their son, Andrew, on the snare. Mr. and Ms. Isaac and Debbie Gibson escorting their daughter, Desiree Fountain, who plays the tuba. Mr. Eric and Jennifer Hill and Evan Hill escorting their daughter and sister, Cassidy, who plays the trumpet. Mr. and Mrs. Joey and Melissa Jackson escorting their daughter Madison, who plays the trumpet. Mr. David Kirkpatrick and Miss Kathy Kirkpatrick escorting their grandson Joey, who plays the trombone. Mr. and Mrs. Landon and Eva Lee escorting their son Owen, who's a drum major. Mr. Charlie Livesey and Gayla Livesey escorting their daughter and sister Emily, plays the saxophone. Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie and Marion Long escorting their son Skyler, plays the snare. Mr. and Mrs. Heath and Karen Anderson escorting their daughter Sarah, who plays the flute. Mr. and Mrs. Jean and Tammy Madison escorting their daughter Tori, who plays the flute. Mrs. Rhonda Moore escorting her son Andrew, who plays the quad. Ms. LaShonda Nance and Adrian escorting their daughter and sister Erica, who's in the color guard. Mr. James Pennington and Miss Mary Pennington escorting their daughter Ruby, plays the trumpet. Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Maribel Pisano escorting their daughter Carla, who's in the color guard. Ms. Valenina Potts escorting her son Jason Potts Bonilla, who plays the bass drum. Ms. Kathy Price escorting her son Cody, who plays the cymbals. Ms. Melissa Rios escorting her brother Pete, who plays the trombone. Ms. Rebecca Robinson and Ms. Melissa Robinson escorting their son Sam, who plays the bass drum. Mr. Leo Rodriguez escorting his daughter Jackie, who plays the flute. Ms. Kimberly Spurlock and Mr. Austin Spurlock escorting their daughter and sister Samantha, who plays the baritone. Mr. and Mrs. Michael and Cheryl Stahl escorting their daughter Jamie, who plays the flute. Mr. and Mrs. Vargas escorting their daughter, Hunter, in the color guard. Mr. and Mrs. Donald and Elizabeth Vaughn escorting their son, Isaac, who plays the French horn. Mr. and Mrs. Ty and Audrey Matkin escorting their daughter and sister, Kimberly, who plays the saxophone. Mr. and Mrs. Leonard and Karen White escorting their daughter, Mallory, who plays the trumpet. Mr. and Mrs. Jim and Sue Hill escorting their granddaughter and daughter, Autumn Wilson, who's in the color guard. Ms. Jill Womack and Jerry Womack escorting their son, Seth, who's a drum major. Moving to the blazes, Ms. Lola Galloway and Ms. Carolcia Galloway escorting their granddaughters and sisters, Moesha and Fantasia Thomas, managers and blaze. Mr. Kerry Duffy and Ms. Dorinda Duffy escorting their daughter, Katera, who's a line member. Mr. Joe Oren and Rhonda Oren escorting their daughter, Emily, who's a captain. Mr. Joe Wallace and Mrs. Shannon Wallace escorting their daughter, Lindy, who's a sergeant. Mr. Geraldo Aguilar and Anna Aguilar escorting their daughter, Esmeralda, who's sergeant. Mr. J.D. McCoy and Mrs. Jennifer McCoy escorting their daughter, Brianna, the senior lieutenant officer. Mr. Jason Wilkinson and Ms. Stephanie Olinsky escorting their daughter, Chaslin, line member. Jacqueline, a line member. Mr. Alfonso Mora and Ms. Bertha Mora escorting their daughter, Andrea, who's a co-captain. Ms. Amanda Arneson and Mr. Chris Arneson escorting their son, Samuel, who's a manager. Mr. Gabriel Gomez, Ms. Maria Gomez escorting their daughter, Sonia, the baby blades. Now the cheerleaders. Mr. Jason Thompson and Ms. Holly Thompson escorting their daughter Story, captain. Mr. Jeb Brooks and Ms. Ginger Brooks escorting their daughter Summer, co-captain. Mr. Wayne Cooper and Mrs. Tammy Cooper escorting their daughter Kylie, who's a co-captain. Ms. Leonetta Pryor and the late Larry Pryor Sr. escorting her daughter, Lemire, the cheerleader. Mr. Orrin Boyette and Mrs. Janine Boyette escorting their daughter Emma, cheerleader, and oboe. Ms. Jennifer Lansu escorting her daughter, Anna Marie Winborn, a cheerleader. Mr. Mike Story and Mrs. Amanda Story escorting their daughter, Alexa, cheerleader. Mr. Chad Falmer and Ms. Holly Falmer escorting their daughter, Carson, cheerleader. Mr. Robert Stout and Mrs. Tina Stout escorting their son, Tyler, who's in the cat pack. Mr. Brian Allen and Mrs. Vicki Allen escorting their son, Jesse, who's in the cat pack. Mr. Ignacio Orozco and Mrs. Josefina Orozco escorting their son, Ignacio, also in the cat pack. Mr. Bradley Martin and Mrs. Kristen Martin escorting their daughter, Abby, student body president. Mr. Jason Evans and Mrs. Angie Evans escorting their daughter, Sadie, student body vice president. Mr. John Burning and Mrs. Susan Burning escorting their daughter, Sarah, student body secretary. Mr. and Mrs. Nick and Barbara Theophilides escorting their daughter, Alex, student body treasurer. Mr. Jeff Bledsoe and Mrs. Loretta Bledsoe escorting their daughter, Allison, student body reporter. Mr. and Mrs. Clay Johnson escorting their daughter, Emily, a drum major and student body historian. Mr. Terry Fain and Ms. Holly Fain escorting their son, Will, student body activities director and member of the Cat Pack. Mr. Zenobio Godino and Mrs. Maria Godino escorting their son Juan, student body member at large and member of the Cat Pack. Ladies and gentlemen, a nice round of applause for all of our seniors participating tonight and their parents.